so that those people who are not able to join us today will be able to watch it back and be a part of this learning as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming. This is Beyond the Binary, and it will be first a 3-series class. So this is the first of the 3 classes. And this first class is...
So this is Adam Harishon. We're going to talk about the first human being created in Genesis, in Bereshit. So today we will specifically be looking at these stories through lenses that might be a little bit different from the ones that we used when we first learned the story growing up. And this might validate you, this might challenge you, and we look forward to having those discussions with you. And if you have not already added your pronouns to your Zoom name and you would like to, one way that you can do this is to hover your mouse over your picture, to click the 3 dots in the upper right-hand corner, scroll down to rename, and then you can add your pronouns in your Zoom name so that people can know how to refer to you. Speaking of pronouns, a quick introduction of who we are before we get started. My name is Ze'evi Berman. I use ze, them, their, or they, them, their pronouns. I am a 4th-year student at Hebrew Union College, which is the Reform Seminary, and I'm working toward ordination as a cantor, which will hopefully happen in 2 years. And this year, I'm specifically working toward my master's in Jewish education.
And my name is Ariel Zitny. I use the pronouns he, him, or they, them. Either set works. I am also a student at Hebrew Union College. I am studying to become a rabbi on the same track as Ze'evi, so hopefully in a couple of years we will be ordained together. And I am also taking this year to get a master's of Jewish education. And if you didn't know previously also, we'll just be transparent and say that we are a couple. So we love working together. We love being able to teach together. And if we seem really close, we are. So.
Also this year, I'm serving as the guest Cantorial intern at CBST. So if you've seen me leading services, that was me. And
I am the director of the upcoming Trans Jews Are Here Convening, which will take place on March 31st, which is Transgender Day of Visibility. And really excited to have a new gathering of trans Jews and trans learning.
It's going to be really wonderful.
So continuing to talk about what this course is. This course will be, as I said earlier, a 3-session course. So this is the first session of 3. We will explore biblical stories through gender expansive commentary. Part of this is looking at the stories in the Torah themselves, looking at the stories from the direct source, and then also looking at different rabbinic commentaries and interpretations of these stories. And so through this process, we'll learn a little bit not only about our Torah texts, but also about rabbinic text and about the Jewish process of interpretation and text study. And so we'll learn a bit about our characters from the Torah, and also a bit about the cultural context of the rabbis and what thoughts were going through their heads as they were interpreting stories from the Torah. We will also meet the 6 rabbinic classifications of gender. We have long believed that gender binary, the gender binary, was passed to us since the beginning of time, and that it's only been recently that we've started to think about gender differently and started to think about gender beyond the idea of a gender binary. And a lot of this actually has put blame on Judaism specifically as being the originator of this idea of the gender binary. So we will do a little bit to learn how this is only one perspective and one side of the story of gender in Judaism, and how there's this whole other side of gender in Judaism that involves these different classifications of gender, with 6 gender classifications and possibly even 7. So hopefully through this, we can reframe our mindset of the ancient perspective of gender and how this gender binary has developed. And lastly, with all of these tech studies and with what we're learning together, we will start to reconceptualize Jewish belief about gender. So through learning about the different conceptions about gender, different gender identities that possibly existed within our biblical characters, and different genders within Judaism itself, we can reconceptualize what Judaism has to say about gender and how we might then be able to influence our own Jewish communities to help our personal Jewish communities start to reconceptualize their Jewish view of gender as well.
So we are going to get started I'm going to put this link in the chat. Before we dive into text, we're just going to take a moment to reflect on what we already know about the creation of humans in Genesis. So if you are on a computer or a phone with internet access or a tablet, you can click this link in the chat, or you can type in the link on the slide. And if you follow the link, it will direct you to a website with a little plus sign in the bottom right corner. You can click the plus sign and add your answers to this question. What do you already know about the creation of the first humans in Genesis? So you don't have to worry about getting this right or correct, because we're just establishing a baseline of knowledge that we are going to both build on and also challenge through looking at the stories through the lens of gender expansiveness in this course. The link doesn't work. That's very interesting. Is that true for other people? It works for some people. Okay. So if it doesn't work to copy paste it, see if you can type it from the text on the slide right here. Thank you, Frank. Yes, it might help to add http:// Perfect. Thank you very much. So take a few moments now to answer this question. And as you answer, you'll also see all of the other answers populate. And I am just loving reading what everyone is typing. I know that this story is very much ingrained in our cultural understanding. This is one of the first stories that a lot of people learn about Torah, about the Bible. I know it might look a little chaotic right now.
I think it looks alive. It's just new answers popping up. That's great. I love it. Get the sense of communication and participation. Keep it coming.
And for those people who don't know anything about the story, that is awesome as well. We are going to read it in summary. We are going to read it in the exact text of the verses, and we'll do a lot of discovery today. So for those of you who have a lot of background knowledge, that's wonderful. For those of you who have no background knowledge, that's also wonderful. So for someone who posted, where do you type it? At the bottom right corner, there's a little pink box that has a plus sign. If you click that, then you can type your comment. I see so much diversity in these answers. And if you are done typing, I encourage you to also scroll through and see if you can read a few answers that are not yours. And don't worry, you don't need to click anything for it to post. It is already there. It will pop up the moment you type the first character.
Which makes it a little hard to see if people are done typing.
It is.
But let's maybe see if we can read some of these answers.
Sure. Okay, This is as just a random selection. Ariel and I will ping pong. So if yours doesn't get read, it is just as valid, we promise. Eve was created from one of Adam's ribs. The story I heard as a child was God created Adam and knew that he needed company and then created Eve from Adam's rib.
There are two creation stories in Genesis.
First human was male and female and them.
I think Adam was made first and then Eve from his rib.
There was a lot of editing and merging of the stories. Male and female, God created them, could be just one person.
See some comments about Lilith too, which is awesome because that's already bringing in the interpretive tradition.
Wonderful. The first human was just a human without a gender designation, and from the difference came the designation. These are like sneak previews into what we're going to be looking at today. Okay, so we will leave this document up as a live document. Feel free to keep adding to it, but we'll move back now to our story. And before we dive in to study some text, I want to do a short note about translation. So I translated the Hebrew in some very specific ways. Whereas many of us learn about the creation of humans, as I saw it in our Padlet, as Adam and Eve, we are going to translate the word Adam in Hebrew as simply human. So Hebrew, as many of you I'm sure know, is a gendered language. That means that all words in Hebrew have gender, including words like, say, tree or water or chair. And this gendering of nouns has nothing to do with the way that we understand gender for people, the way that we understand our genders as people. So the word Adam in Hebrew means simply human being. And just as with objects, because Hebrew is a gendered language, it does take the masculine form. So for those of you who can understand Hebrew, you will see that Adam, the word human, takes the masculine form. But I want us to try to not see that as a gender, and more so just as a grammatical construct. This first Adam is not specifically masculine, just because the word Adam takes masculine words grammatically. So you'll see that instead of using he or him or his in translations, I used very, very unspecific language like it or they to designate singular or plural. So we'll be stepping away from conceptualizing the first human as a guy named Adam, and more so as Adam, the human being, whose gender we will find out when we read the verses, when we encounter it through words that specifically describe human gender.
And another sort of caveat before we get started is, as some of you mentioned in the Padlet, there are two creation stories in Genesis. And I know for me, this was a shock for me when I actually learned about this, because when I was younger, the two stories were sort of merged together as one with some like heavy-handed editing from my religious school teachers. And I wasn't really clued into the fact that there are really distinct creation stories. And this is really important because this tension between the first story and the second story is part of where this discussion is born, out of the confusion of why there are two stories presented, whether the two stories presented are versions of the same story, and how they can both exist at the same time.
So as we read the first 27 verses of Genesis, don't worry, we'll read it in summary and only look at specific verses in particular. I want us to focus on a few different things. So we'll keep these questions in mind that will allow us to compare and contrast the two creation stories in Genesis 1 and then in Genesis 2. So the framing questions that I want us to try to keep in the back of our minds as we read Genesis 1 are first, where is the Adam? Where is the human placed in the order of creation? Second, what do you think that says about the Adam? Is that a judgment on the Adam? How was the Adam created? Do we get descriptions of what was the basis of the Adam or the act of creation of the Adam? What is the reason for the Adam's creation? And finally, how many humans were created in this story? And if you only can focus your brain on one of those, I would encourage you to focus it on the very last one, because that is the point that we will explore in commentary. Okay, so here is a short summary of Genesis 1, the verses 1 through 25, the first 25 verses of Genesis. So keep the guiding questions in your mind, and then we'll look at the exact language of the very next two verses. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was tohu vavohu, translated often as unformed and void. There was darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind of God swept over the water. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good and separated the light from darkness, calling the light day and the darkness night. There was evening, there was morning, a first day. On the second day, God separated water from water, creating an expanse, which was called sky. And on the third day, God gathered the water below the sky together, creating dry land, which was called earth. On that earth, God created vegetation of every kind that bore seeds. On the fourth day, God created lights in the sky that shined upon the earth to separate day from night, serving as signs for the days and the years to mark our time. The greater light dominated the day, the lesser light dominated the night, separating light from darkness. On the fifth day, God created swarms of living creatures from the waters, birds that fly in the sky, and living creatures of every kind that creep. God blessed them to be fertile and multiply. On the sixth day, God created cattle, creeping things, and wild beasts from the earth. So we've gone from the very first day of creation to the sixth day of creation, and we still have no mention of the Adam, no mention of the human being. Now we get to verse 26. So this is a continuation of the sixth day. We now finally get to the creation of the first human. So a small reminder that when we see the word Adam, we are still going to translate this as human, and we still don't know the gender of the first human. So we read, Vayomer Elohim na'aseh Adam, b'tzalmenu kidmutenu, v'yirdu v'gat hayam, uve'of hashamayim, uve'behema uvechol haaretz, uvechol haremes haromes al haaretz. And God said, let us make Adam, the human, in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on the earth. So this is our first mention of humans in Genesis. So thinking back to our guiding questions, what do we see here about how and why human beings were created? Feel free to drop a comment in the chat or raise your hand through the raise hand functions if you would like to add a comment. Yes.
I think, again, what I'm really mocked by, and this is something that actually has come to me later in life, is the fact that it says, let us make Adam in our image. It doesn't have a gendered image. And it to me, it reinforces this notion of gender being a very human concept. And to me, it seems like it's very much about Adam being in a non-gendered image.
I love that being created in the image of God inherently means that gender is completely unspecified. Thank you. To read some of what I see in the chat, a plural being is making human, not being defined by gender. Adam was created to be co-creators with God on earth, and that this is a delegation of responsibility. Wonderful. Okay, let us move to the next verse. So this is the verse that is the crux of most of the commentary of Genesis 1. This is the verse that creates all of the confusion. So let's see if we can dive in. We read, Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam b'tzalmo, b'tzelem Elohim bara oto, zachar u'nekeva bara otam. And God created the Adam in God's image. In the image of God, God created it. Male and female, God created them. So first we see here this idea that God is created, that Adam, the human, is created in God's image. We saw it twice in the verse before. We see it twice in the verse here. And for me, this shows that the most important thing to know about the Adam in Genesis 1, and this is my personal opinion, is that the Adam was created in the image of God. This is what is hammered over and over and over in these verses that we see. But we also see some grammatical inconsistencies. We see some really, really confusing language being used to describe the Adam. First, we see God created it, bara oto, in the singular. And then second, we see zachar u'nkeva bara otam in the singular. Male and female, God in the plural. Male and female, God created them. So before we look at commentary that tries to dissect this and interpret it and explain all of these inconsistencies, I would love to know how you explain this seeming discrepancy in this one verse about the ways that the Adam is described.
And to return to that original discussion question, how many people are being described here?
Absolutely, thank you. Feel free to use the raise hand function, and I'm also scrolling through the chat as well. How would you describe this verse? How would you explain what is happening here? Adam, the human, is male and female and in the image of God. Yes, absolutely. And we will get back to sex and gender, I promise. We will touch that. Yes, please. Judy, would you like to speak? So I see a lot of people writing in the chat. I encourage you to also open the chat and scroll through, but I'll also raise up a few of the comments. I think we are yet to get to describing individual people or a number of people. The language is still very general. Yes. It was the creation of a multitude of people. They can be male, female, or both at least. Two things happening at once. First, describing the creation of a specific human and applying the divine source, this divine source, to all of humanity throughout time. I love these interpretations. Humanity as past, present, and future. Adam as a representation of humanity as a whole. God contains all gender. Adam does not seem to have the plural grammatical form. Thousands of humans might have been created, male and female being condensed. There are so many more that I didn't get to read. Feel free to scroll through yourself. What I love is that we can be interpreters of the same verse that biblical commentators interpreted in some of the first centuries CE. We're still grappling with exactly the same verses today. So as we continue to try to grapple with this, we're going to now move on to Genesis 2, the second creation story in Genesis.
So some framing questions for Genesis 2 before we read the text, just some things to keep in mind. Where is the Adam placed in order of creation in this creation story? How is that different from Genesis 1? How was the Adam created? How does this compare to Genesis 1? What is the reason given for Adam's creation? How is this different from what Genesis 1? And how would you compare and contrast the way the Adam is described in Genesis 1 and 2? So for the texts, summary of verses 1 through 6. When God made earth and heaven, there were no shrubs on the earth, no grasses in the fields, because God had not yet sent rain down to the earth, and there was no Adam, no human, to work the soil. Instead, water would well up from the ground and water the whole surface of the earth. And God formed the Adam from the dust of the earth. God blew into the Adam's nostrils the breath of life, and the Adam became a living being. So we continue with Genesis 2:8 through 21. God made a garden of Eden and placed the Adam there. There, God caused trees to grow that were beautiful and good for food, with the tree of life in the middle of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and bad. A river flowed from Eden to water the garden that then branched in 4 directions. God placed the Adam in the Garden of Eden to tend to it and warned the Adam to eat from any tree except the tree of knowledge. God said, "It is not good for the Adam to be alone. I will make a helper opposite the Adam." God then created beasts from the earth, birds of the sky, and brought them to the Adam to name them. From all the animals, no suitable helper opposite the Adam was found. So we return to our questions. How is this creation story different from the one that preceded it? Firstly, where did the Adam fall in the order of creation in this story? So we saw in the first story, human was the last thing created. How does Genesis 2 compare with this one? I love that comment. Adam is the star of this story. Yes. Things were created for the Adam. Right. A lot of you are touching on the fact that the Adam was created first, and everything as a result was created for the Adam, as opposed to in the first story, it seems like the Adam is created for everything that was already created, right? Everything that was already created needed someone to tend to it. So the Adam was created as a helper, as a manager, as some of you said. And in this story, it seems to be sort of reversed, that the Adam was made first and everything else was created in service maybe to the Adam.
And I just want to answer one of the questions. When I summarized it, I picked the word opposite. And I did actually, I got it from the Hebrew. The Hebrew says mineged, which actually means opposite to, contrasting, in some ways even maybe conflicting. So that is more of a direct translation. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also a really great question too, because we have the word in Hebrew opposite. It means both something opposing, but also something standing next to, right? If things are opposite each other, it means that they're facing each other and they're next to each other. So in one way, we get the connotation that they're contrasting each other, they're opposing each other. And another way we get that they're equals, that they're peers, that they stand face to face, and that they can speak eye to eye, so to speak. So part of this is that them not being able to find a helper that could be opposite the Adam is that there was only one Adam, and the Adam needed another Adam to be equal. Or at least that's how we read it. And it is open for interpretation and ripe with multiple meanings. So another question is, how would you compare and contrast the way that Adam is described in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and this creation story? We got some comments already on that, but if there are stark differences to you of the Adam from the first creation story and the Adam from the second creation story, feel free to expand on that now in the chat. Or if you process better verbally, feel free to use the raise hand function and we can call on you too. Oh, we have a hand raise. Please, Alex.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting that the stress on in the image of God in the first chapter isn't here, and rather we have Adam being created from the earth. So there's a very different sort of like generative seed, if you will, like the raw material seems to be stipulated as like different in the two of them.
That's a great point. Yeah. So in the first one, there's such an emphasis on being made in the image of God, and in this one, we don't see it mentioned at all. And as someone had mentioned in the chat earlier, there were multiple times that being made in the image of God had been mentioned in Genesis 1, and so we saw repetition in the first Genesis story, and it's totally absent in this Genesis creation story. I also saw a mention in the chat that. One, gender isn't mentioned yet. We have the creation of the Adam and no gender is brought up. We will get to gender, but at this point with the creation of the first human, there's no gender mentioned yet. And also there was no Garden of Eden in the first creation story. That is another difference. So we will continue with
now the second human. So whereas the first in the first creation story in Genesis 1 only includes Ha-Adam, the first human, Genesis 2 also brings up this idea of what about the next human? So a few framing questions before we begin looking at the exact text of these verses. If you think back to what you saw in the Padlet that either you contributed or that someone else contributed, who is this second human? And there's going to be one word that I have specifically left untranslated in the translation of the next two verses. And this word is tsela. So I want you, as we read, to try to translate this word in your head from what you read in the Padlet, from what you already know, or you can just be completely confused, and that is okay, and we will read commentary together. So I also want us to focus on how was the second human created in Genesis? How does this creation mirror or contrast the creation of Ha-Adam, the first human, in either Genesis 1 or in Genesis 2? And also, where we keep bringing this up, where do you find gender in these verses? Okay, so we'll read, Vayapel Adonai Elohim tardema al ha'adam, vayishan vayikach achat mitzalotav, vayisgor basar tachtena. So God caused the Adam to fall into a deep sleep, and while the Adam slept, God took one tsela, see if you can figure out what you think that means, from the human, from the Adam, and closed up the flesh at that spot. So the first Adam was put into a deep sleep, which helped God take one tsela from the Adam, however we're going to translate that, and then closed up the flesh at that spot. Okay, let's keep going. Vayiven Adonai Elohim et hatsela asher lakach min ha'adam le'isha vayivieha el ha'adam. And God fashioned the tsela that God had taken from the Adam into a woman, and God brought her to the Adam. Okay, so for those of you who haven't yet, drop into the chat how you have been taught or how you would like to interpret the word tsela. I see here tsela meaning component, tsela meaning rib, tsela meaning side, tsela meaning part, one cell, bone. And I see a reflection here of, I was taught rib, but I'm not sure that I think it's a rib. I was also taught rib, and I remember sitting in Hebrew school going, I'm not sure I think that. And I was really excited to find commentary to support another interpretation. So if that bothers you, hang on to that, and we will read some interpretation that will offer a very different kind of picture. But let's move on to the second guiding question.
Do we want to address the woman here is distinct from human?
Oh, yes, thank you.
In Hebrew, there are different words to connote gender, and we see a distinction between Adam, which we translate as human, and Ish and Isha, which we will translate as man and woman. So here we see Isha, which definitely means woman. So that is a very gendered word.
For sure. So the question of where do we find gender in these verses is for sure in the Isha. The creation of the second human being was inherently gendered because this second human being isn't even described as an Adam. The second human being is described as an Isha, a woman. So what about this creation of the second human being? What is this act of creation? Where does it come from? How is it originated? Was it in the image of anything? How would you contrast this to the creation of the Adam in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2? Again, you can use the chat or you can use the raise hand function if you prefer. Sherry, would you like to share with us?
Yes, I was just going to say in the first story, there are multiple humans, and it's more egalitarian than in the second story.
Interesting. Yes, I saw that there were some people who interpreted the first story as the creation of a multiplicity of humans, whereas the second story is a little bit more narrow.
Right, because in the first we see that it does say it and them, so we see the parallel between the singular and the plural, but in the second story we don't see any hint of that plural really until the Isha. Mm-hmm. We have another hand.
Yes, please.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. Yeah, it also seems like God is busy presenting things to the Adam. So first God presents all these animals, none of them are good enough or aren't the right thing. So now God makes this woman and presents this woman to Adam, which makes her very much more like a possession and not nearly as high of a rank. Or if you want to say, I don't know how else to put it, as the Adam.
Yeah, from what I hear, there's a hierarchy here in the creation of Ha-Adam, and then the creation of a woman being presented to Ha-Adam as almost like a possession. We'll see that commentary really takes this and flips it right on its head. So speaking so much about commentary, let us dive into some commentary. And I see there's so many comments in the chat, and I am really inspired by all of your interpretations. I would encourage you also to scroll through the chat and look at the opinions of your peers. They are wonderful.
And I think a lot of them will resurface too as we continue. So the commentary that we'll look at today is from Breshit Rabbah, which is a midrash, which is a type of rabbinic commentary. And it was on Genesis. Breshit is the Hebrew word for Genesis. And it was written between the 4th and 6th centuries. A little bit about Midrash. Midrash is a type of interpretation, really, of biblical interpretation. It comes from the root Daled Resh Shin, which is the same root that we get for a drasha, or a darshan, darshanit, darshanet, the person who gives a sermon in services. So we see this connection between the word midrash and sermons or interpretations or different commentaries and viewpoints on Torah. And this one specifically is on Genesis, as we said. And the crux really of biblical interpretation is there is something within the text that sparks in the rabbis a need to respond to it and a need to interpret it. So this spark within the text is generally perceived as somewhat of a problem. What is the problem within the text that they are looking to solve, that their interpretation will help solve? And the desire behind this is to show that things that seem to be contradictory or confusing within the Torah are actually not contradictory or confusing, that there's just additional levels of interpretation and meaning that need to be brought out of it. And so Midrash attempts to bring out these additional meanings to help make sense of the text. So when we're looking at the Midrash, we want to keep in the back of our head, what is the problem that these rabbis are responding to? And we'll see that a large part of what their problem is was that original verse in Genesis 1:27, that we made note to keep in the back of your mind. Male and female, God created it. Male and female, God created them. Of this discrepancy between the it and the them, before we get to Genesis 2, where Eve, where the Isha was very obviously created. So they're asking the question, how many people are present right now? And they're looking to solve that.
And I saw that some of you in the chat also said male and female only. That seems restrictive. Commentary also addresses that, and we'll look also at more modern commentary that looks at that looks at expanding gender beyond just male and female.
Which actually brings us really perfectly to our next slide. Oh, sorry, I see Stacy, you raised your hand.
I have a question. In the slides, it keeps saying CE, which means the common era. But isn't our Torah BCE?
Yes, that is a great question. So the Torah was made before the Common Era, but these commentaries on the Torah were made after. So these commentaries are later.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that question. So the next thing that we need a little bit of a definition for is this word that we're going to see that's going to show up in these commentaries from Breshit Rabbah, and this is the word androgynos. And this might look a little familiar to you because a couple of people actually put this in the chat and they put it on the Padlet. So we're so excited that for some of you, this is not entirely new information. So this idea, androgynos, is one of the 6 rabbinic categories of gender, as we had said earlier. And it is defined as a person who has both male and female characteristics. So we're not going to get into all of the 6 classifications of gender right now. We will do that in another class, but today we really just want to focus on androgynos. And something else that we need to sort of have a caveat for is we use the word gender, and we will continue to use the word gender, but for most people listening, gender has a very different connotation than what it did 2,000 years ago. We all now live in a post-Judith Butler era, and we really like to think Judith Butler is so brilliant and amazing that her word just has always been truth, and we project it back into the past to say sex and gender has always been separate, and when we use those words, we need to mean them to be separate things, with sex being biological and gender being sociocultural. And I understand that that is the current reality for most of us in this Zoom room. However, I ask you to please just suspend disbelief while we are here together. Let's go back in time to be during the culture and time of the rabbis who are writing this text. And so for them, there is no distinction between sex and gender. There's just one word, gender, and it encompasses what we would consider to be biological and what we would consider to be sociocultural. And some of what we will do in this course, not just tonight, but in classes to follow, is to analyze how it was biological for them and how it was sociocultural for them, because those distinctions might not be exactly what we would think of them today. So that's just a disclaimer. When we say gender, please just use that to mean both what we would now say as gender and sex. So we start out our first part of Genesis Rabbah, of Breshit Rabbah. Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar said, "At the time when the Holy One, blessed be God, created the first Adam, God created it as an androgynos, as it is written, male and female, God created them. So this is the first line that introduces this commentary on the first human being androgynos. So looking at this text that Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar said, God created the first human as an androgynos, based on this verse from Genesis, male and female, God created them. How does Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar attempt to explain this verse, male and female, God created them? Feel free to put your answer in the chat or use the raise hand function. Awesome. So we got some comments about this pronoun issue, right? We have first a singular pronoun and then a plural pronoun, but we only saw the creation of one being. So we have this singular they person. Great.
So building off of what Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar said, because commentary often works as sort of like a layer cake. They comment on each other while they also comment on Torah. So Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman said, at the time when the Holy One, blessed be God, created the first Adam, God created it with a double face, one on each side, and then split the Adam along the middle and created two backs, one back here and one back there. Okay, so this is a little bit of a wacky image. I see some of you trying to figure out how it looked. See if you can visualize, just like that song from Hedwig and the Inch. I love it. See if you can visualize this androgynos, this being, according to Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman. It's one being that encapsulates both male and female, both masculine and feminine. And then we get the creation of the second being that we know is then described as an Isha, not by the taking of one of the first, a part of the first being, but instead by splitting the first being all along the middle to create two separate beings. This may seem a little bit wacky to you. This may fly in the face of all of the things that you have learned about the creation of the first humans in Genesis. And if you're thinking to yourself, this seems a little wackadoodle, you would not be the first person to think that. And we actually see some pushback in the Midrash itself. So the contemporaries of Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman, the other sages, challenged him. And they said, doesn't it say God took one of the tzelot, which is the Hebrew plural of tzela, from the Adam? And as a lot of you commented in the chat, they are translating tzela here as rib. Didn't God take one of the ribs from the Adam? So Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman replies and says, tzela means one of its sides. And he cites a verse in Exodus 26:20 that says, and for the tzela of the tabernacle, which they translate as side of the tabernacle. So Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman's argument really hinges on this translation of the word tzela. He says you cannot translate tzela as rib, because you would never say rib of the tabernacle. That doesn't make any sense. You would say side of the tabernacle. So just as we say tzela of the tabernacle, side of the tabernacle, we must read it side of the Adam. So instead of this creation of the second human being taking a rib from the first Adam, Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman says it's not that at all. It's taking an entire side, an entire half of the first Adam to create the second. So I'm wondering, Do you buy this read? Do you buy this translation? Does this translation of side make sense to you? Or would you like to stick instead with rib? I see a question, is there a relation between Sela and Selem? There is not, according to Hebrew grammar. Shorashim, roots in Hebrew, have 3 letters, and it only has 2 letters in common, which means the meaning is not parallel, but you could definitely spin an interpretation off of that for sure.
And there are definitely midrash that have connections that say, this kind of sounds like that. So even if there's not a logical root system, people still make those connections based on the way things sound.
Absolutely. So even if technically no, you can absolutely base an interpretation off of it.
I think I saw a question in the chat of how could a side be taken if a person had 2 faces. So I think the way that I think about it is that we see this image of cutting in the original text. There's like a cutting open. And so when they say take a side, it's kind of more of a figurative of, by splitting them in half, you're taking a side from each of them and separating the sides. So the idea is you're creating a new side by having that separation.
I'm reading some of the chats, and it seems like generally people enjoy the interpretation of side, even though it seems like a very messy way of creating the first human beings. There is actually a section of Talmud that deals with, why didn't God just create 2 humans instead of creating 1 and then having to split them in half? And the reason is because it's important that we're all descended from one ancestor, so that none of us can say that we are in some way better than another person. So what does it mean to you that, according to this text, we are all descended from a multi-gendered first human? Whether or not you interpret Torah as truth of the world or just as a remnant of our cultural history of Judaism, what does it mean to you to interpret the story of the creation of human beings as we are all descended from a multi-gendered being? What significance does that have for you? Please.
To me, it legitimizes all gender. To me, at least, it legitimizes all genders as images of God. If you ask me, it I think really helps to legitimize the idea that male and female are not just the images of God. That gender is such a beautiful spectrum, and that I think having the multi-gender first human helps to legitimize that.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree. So going back to something that a few of you have put in the chat, that it still seems like we have this hierarchy of male and female. We have this hierarchy of gender, and still in this phrase, Zachar nekeva bara otam, male and female, God created them, we have this binary language. So what do we do with that? We're going to look at some more modern commentary to try to expand this view.
So there's this concept of merism that is used in literature, which essentially means that 2 contrasting parts, 2 opposing dichotomous entities, actually are representative of the whole. So not only is each part representing a polar opposite, but it's representing everything within that spectrum as well. So we have this idea that this verse, male and female, God created them, is actually a merism. It's not talking about 2 things, but it's talking about a wide spectrum of things that are encompassed within these 2 seemingly opposing identities or entities. So just as we saw earlier in creation, there was morning and there is evening, a first day, we can look and see just because God created morning and God created evening does not mean that noontime does not exist, or that there's no such thing as twilight or dawn or dusk or any of these other times that exist within that spectrum of morning and evening. That morning and evening are not actually a creation of two things, but it is a creation of something that is beyond words, that can be more easily summed up within this dichotomy of morning and evening. So a lot of modern commentary looks at this language of male and female, God created them, to not actually be reinforcing a gender binary, but to be encompassing of this spectrum of within the categories of male and female and everything in between. God created everything. God created all gender. God created all gender identities. And we see that a little bit in the fact that this is used to represent a singular person and then is used to represent two different people as well. So we can see that argumentation being used to support the idea that this encompasses people who do not fit within singularly male or singularly female categorizations.
And even building off of that, Chassidut, some more modern Hasidic interpretations of this story of the androgynos, the Adam being split into two, Chassidut says that this split was not in any way even. It did not have only male on this side and only female on this side, that there is a blending of gender, a blending of masculine and feminine, of male and female in every single human being. Because this first being of an androgynos could not be split evenly into binary gender, that we are all in some way reflections of this first multi-gendered being. Gender is flexible, gender is expansive within each of us in different ways. So I would love, in the last minute that we have, and if you have a few more minutes other than that, for us to return to this Padlet that we had in the beginning. And I want you to think of, what have you been validated by? What have you been challenged by in the lenses that we've used for this story today? How has your knowledge of this story expanded? How has your knowledge of this story felt like it reflects who you are, in a way that you can maybe see yourself in this story a little bit better? Take a few moments and I'll drop that link in one more time into the chat to see if we can add even more to this living document that we've created together.
And again, if people process better out loud and want to verbally comment, we welcome you also to use the raise hand function so we can call on you and hear your voice.
And I know we haven't been able to get to all of the comments in the chat, but I really look forward to reading them and learning from your interpretations and your comments on the story. Please.
Sorry for talking so much. It's just so affirming, especially as someone who's non-binary, who has both aspects of it, and somehow those days where I'm like, I want to be more masculine, I want to be more feminine, and just to have our ancestor represent that is just so affirming, and it in a way that, I don't know, I'm really emotionally overwhelmed and very pleased in a way that's really hard to voice.
I definitely understand that, because I also relate to that personally. We are both non-binary, and reading Torah from a non-binary perspective allows us to really see ourselves in the foundations of Judaism.
And this is just the beginning also. We have so much more to share with you that we are really excited to get to. So if some of you feel like we haven't really touched on like the social aspects of gender or even the biological aspects of gender, we know we haven't gotten there yet, but there's just so much to cover, and we will get there, and we're excited to get there.
Thank you so much for sharing your voices and sharing your comments. And we hope to see you in future classes where we'll look at even more ways to study gender expansiveness in Jewish text.
Thank you, everyone.